Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Robert Colville, Director of the Centre for Policy Studies. With me is Dr. Dambisa Moyo, who really doesn't need much of an introduction. She's one of the world's most influential economists and public intellectuals. She's been in Time's list of the most 100.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Robert Colville, Director of the
100 most influential people.
With me is Dr. Dambisa Moyo.
YouTube has now started playing me in Echo, which is an interesting experience. Dr. Moyo, so she's worked at the World Bank, at Goldman Sachs. She's been on the board of Barclays Bank and 3M, and is one of the people best positioned to tell us exactly what's happening in the world economy as this pandemic rages. I was also quite amused that your latest book was called Edge of Chaos, which you probably presumably didn't quite appreciate how close to the edge.
Not. And I'll tell you, the publishers were also slightly reluctant to use the title at the time, and now they think I was a genius in coming up with the title. I wasn't actually, but here we are.
Well, brilliant. So we'll talk for maybe about 20 minutes or so, then I'll try and open it out to questions. There's a Q&A function, so you should all be able to post messages or put them in the chat, whichever's more convenient. And you can also raise your hand to speak directly. So we'll start off on a sort of. I imagine you, like the rest of us, when this started, we were looking at past pandemics and thinking, generally this is a short, sharp shock. Generally speaking, this is V-shaped. And as it's gone on, most people I know seem to have become much more pessimistic about the situation. Is that a fair reflection?
Yes, I think that's pretty accurate. I think perhaps the thing that we all hadn't fully appreciated was the fact that the world was already before the global pandemic already in a pretty precarious place, both economically and geopolitically. So economically, we know that we were already in a world of low, slow, and in some cases no growth. We'd already had a couple of quarters last year where Germany literally had 0% growth. We had many countries, especially the large emerging market economies, growing far below the rate of growth that they need to be growing at in order to double per capita incomes in a generation. So the rule of thumb is essentially the rule of 72. It should be around 3% growth. It should be 7% for countries that are of lower, starting off from a lower economic base. And really, if you look around the world, many countries, rich or poor, were growing far below even 3%. We had already entered into a situation where public policy had become somewhat impotent. We had a situation where we were negative interest rates in terms of public policy, in terms of Europe and Japan, and also grappling with enormous amounts of debt. And if you look at a chart going back 100 years, you could see that the sheer amount of debt that the global economy was carrying, but specifically large economies were carrying, such as across Europe and the United States itself, was already at very worrying levels. This backdrop was already a confluence, so low growth, high debt, massive deficits, and real concerns about the sort of effectiveness and efficacy of public policy was already in train. So this, in fact, if you look at something like the Congressional Budget Office, which does forecasts in the United States, they had already started to caution about 2030 really being D-Day. A point where entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and sort of pensions were essentially underfunded, and there would be a real risk that the government would be in a very dangerous place. So, what essentially the COVID or the global pandemic has done is to accelerate, or it's been catalytic, effectively, to getting us to a point that we were already worrying about, and in that respect. Governments and corporations are having to really scramble to figure out what sorts of policy and what sorts of efforts should be put in place now to address the precarious environment in which we're operating.
And one of the interesting things from the polling I've seen is that people seem to sort of trust government's response more than businesses' response. we had CT Group have been doing a tracker throughout the crisis in various countries, and it seems to show us sort of pretty generally people saying, we think our governments have done well, although that's been on the slide recently in some countries, including this one. But there's a feeling that sort of business hasn't really stepped up as much.
Well, I disagree, and perhaps I would disagree. I'm in the boardrooms of very large corporations. I know what companies are doing. I've actually published recently an article talking about how companies are actually responding to the crisis. Before I maybe give some color on what I think specifically is being done by corporations, it is worth saying that I'm not entirely surprised that people would have a soft spot for government. I think
I should stress this is not my opinion, by the way.
No, I understand, but I think that there's the general sense that for very large, complex, trans-border shocks, which really don't have we don't have visibility in terms of how long, so duration, we have no visibility on how long this is going to go on for, and we don't have visibility in how large the problem is going to be. I think that there is a sense that these sort of problems require coordination at a government level. And so I'm not entirely surprised that there is that view that governments have really had to step up. But really, in terms of corporations, I mean, I have the great privilege of serving on the board of 3M, which is the mask producer. We're producing the N95 masks, a leading producer of those masks. We've had to step up ourselves in terms of being a part of the solution, and at a very broad level, just to give a little bit of a sense of what's going on in these boardrooms, I would separate this, and I published an article in Harvard Business Review about 4 weeks ago, really arguing that the discussions in the boardroom fall into two camps. We are discussing operations, so how do we keep these organizations afloat? And part of that discussion of operations is thinking about who our employees are. So the discussion about these are, you have 50,000 full-time employees has actually been put to one side. Our employees is a much more broadened term. We're now looking at subcontractors as being employees. We're looking at supply chain providers, smaller businesses that provide inputs as being employees. So there's a big issue there. We're grappling with issues around healthcare. Is the employee base healthy? Is it safe? Is it able to operate? Is it able to get access to healthcare given the ravages of the disease? We're looking at working from home, issues around remote working. How do we think about that? How do we make sure that people don't get cyber attacks, et cetera? So there's a lot of infrastructure blocking and tackling that's already going on operationally. And then, of course, financially, there are real issues about making sure that corporations stay afloat. We globally are providing jobs to multiple millions of people around the world. And so making sure that corporations continue on the path of innovation and R&D. I mean, you can see it in places like pharmaceutical companies. They are at the tip of the spear and trying to find a vaccine. So the notion that businesses are not, may not be involved, and I'm picking on pharma, but you can take your pick. Hotels are having to repurpose themselves. We're looking at companies like Amazon really having to reclassify what's urgent, what's essential. We are thinking about solutions and a very, very broad.
But of course, once you go beyond the firefighting to the kind of broader sort of like what happens next stuff, obviously the problem that many companies have is they have no idea how long this is going to go on for.
Yes, and look, I generally, for the 10 years that I've served on corporate boards, I've tended to end up in audit committees and risk and finance committees. And we're in the business of taking risk. Companies are in the business of taking risk. And of course, we try to mitigate risk as much as possible. And the problem and the challenge with these type of complex shocks is that they are multifaceted, and we need information from different areas, whether it's anthropologists and historians, and as you pointed out, how have we dealt with pandemics in the past, but also looking at healthcare professionals, really consulting, not just economists and people in public policy, more, in terms of politicians. So I think what this is calling for is really a grouping of ideas on what is a very complex, multifaceted, and certainly multi-period problem for which we don't have an end date. You could argue in some respects Brexit was that also, perhaps at a lower scale, but it was a complex problem. We didn't know how long it was going to last. We didn't know what the triggers were that would actually come to some sort of conclusion, and we don't know when those, in the case of Brexit, obviously the decision ultimately was made with the most recent past election. But for us now in the business realm, people are looking for a vaccine. I was speaking to a friend who runs a large pharmaceutical company. It takes generally 7 to 10 years to produce a vaccine. We're now hoping that we can get that sooner, but that will materially change how businesses and ultimately government deal with the current pandemic.
Yes, no, I mean, I was involved very tangentially in helping with the publicity around the launch of CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic, and the idea, the point was to try and accelerate that process from years to months, but obviously it's still incredibly difficult. But can I ask, I mean, sort of taking a sort of a more sort of God's eye view of this. I mean, which countries have impressed you in their responses, and which haven't? I think the answers will be quite fairly obvious. But what do you? I'm thinking sort of as much about the economics side of things as the pandemic stuff, because obviously we all know where the death toll figures are and all the rest of it. But in terms of protecting jobs, positioning the economy for what happens next.
Well, so, Robert, you're asking me a kind of normative question. And unfortunately, I think it's too soon to give these guys did a great job, these guys did an awful job. I mean, many of us have been looking to Sweden to see how their alternative approach to combating the pandemic might evolve. I mean, I perhaps, like many other people, was somewhat surprised yesterday to see the sort of acknowledgement by one of the leaders of that approach to, basically the humility to say, hey, we probably didn't get it right. So I don't think that there's anybody.
But interestingly, he didn't say we should have done full lockdown. He said we should have been sort of halfway between where we were and where everyone else was.
For sure, and I think that you'll see a lot more of that. However people, whichever direction people landed. I think that it's easy for me to sit here and say, well, the best numbers in terms of death tolls are in authoritarian states. I don't know if you can say best numbers, but you know what I mean. We're able to mitigate it perhaps the most, but they have levers that we don't have in Western society in order to address these issues. I was just listening this morning. I mean, Brazil's numbers have spiked. They adopted a very different approach. So, I mean, my sense on these issues is it's way too soon to tell. I think there are a lot of questions to be asked about why the institutions that are charged with focusing on pandemics, whether it's CDC in the United States or World Health Organization. I myself in 2017 published an article talking about how this was an unpriced risk, the risk of increasing risk around pandemics.
And Larry Summers and others were saying the same. Yeah.
And we ignored it. When I say we, I worry more that these large institutions whose job it is to come up with a sort of game plan. We had trials, we had SARS, we had MERS, etc. But we clearly were not prepared. And I don't ultimately think that the economic pain is yet being felt. I mean, I think it's clear that there will be many more layoffs, and government only has a certain ability. I'm saying this at a time when the United States has just announced, more layoffs, more people unemployed, registering for unemployment in the US. At the same time, the ECB is increasing their stimulus intervention. So, I don't think we yet know which countries, have done a good job. But what we do know is that we have a lot of data points and different approaches. The UK government approach of paying salaries is quite different from what the US approach was in terms of intervening. So I think there'll be a lot of learnings, but I think it would be far too arrogant at this stage to say these guys did a great job and these guys didn't. I think we have concerns about inflation, the amount of debt that these countries are going to carry, whether they'll be able to get out of it, how are they going to get out of it with no growth? These are all questions that remain.
So that was actually the next question I wanted to ask. I mean, you started by saying, look, we came into this in a worse shape than we appreciated, and actually, you last year you gave a lecture for the CBS on the issue of the structural problems behind stagnant growth and the fact that growth is lower pretty much everywhere than we would expect it to be and want it to be. So I know it's still very early days, but does this crisis lead to people confronting those problems, or does it just make them worse?
Oh, I think, and maybe this is a good opportunity for me to just to articulate what I think we know for a fact is going to happen. I strongly believe that five things will absolutely be true in the certainly the next decade. One, government is already big, but I think it's going to get bigger. I mentioned debts and deficits; those are good metrics to use. Whether what they've done has been a stabilization program or a stimulus program, I personally think the initial reaction was to stabilize the economies. Now they're into stimulus packages. The fact of the matter is that these governments are big; they're getting bigger. Just very quickly, and I've written about this. Angela Merkel talks about 7-25-50. The fact that Europe is just 7% of the world's population, it represents 25% of world GDP, but 50% of world welfare payments. And if you add in the United States, combined, the US and Europe is 12% of the world's population, 50% of GDP, and 90% of welfare payments are in these developed countries. So, her point, which I agree with, is this was already unsustainable. 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging markets. So there are clear vulnerabilities in that type of a system where welfare payments are skewed to just 12% of the population. So that's number one, government's big, getting bigger. Number two, the imports, I believe, this actually is kind of disappointing in many respects, but the importance of government, I think, will also increase. By that, I think we are now going to start to see blurred lines around government being an arbiter of capital and labor. Put in a different way, the pure market capitalist ideas that were espoused by people like Margaret Thatcher, I think are now more and more being shelved. And if you go back in history to the way the United States in particular emerged from the Great Depression, 1929 stock market shock, it was really large welfare programs and large intervention by government, whether it was in tariffs and Smoot-Hawley, or it was bigger programs that FDR instituted. And I think we're moving into that world, and perhaps even more aggressively. We've already seen a sample of it, as I said already, in the UK context, where the government stepped in to essentially pay salaries. How that works out longer term is yet to be determined. A third point I think is really important is that we're seeing the private sector shrink. Again, picking on the United States, but really this is a trend there's a lot of data from Australia and other developed countries that shows that there's been a reduction in the number of publicly traded stocks. In the United States, over the past 10 years, there's been a reduction from around 7,000 stocks publicly traded down to now 50% less, so about 3,500 stocks trade in public markets. That's part of this idea that, and of course, this has major implications for how we invest. State pension funds, where they're going to put that money. I mean, we should care. This is, we all are relying on state pension funds and state-led projects that invest and rely on public markets. But the data is already clear. That trend will continue. Companies are now delisting and becoming more private. And the consequences in terms of transparency, in terms of ability to influence public policy, I think are enormous. The next bullet point really quickly is that there's becoming much more of a concentration in different sectors. So by that, I mean, we're seeing many more monopolies and oligopolies. Think about technology, banking, pharmaceuticals, airlines, energy companies. We have fewer and fewer large companies. And so the notion of perfectly competitive, which is what market capitalism is supposed to support, seems to be moving further and further into the rear view mirror. And so again, not very much antithetical to the view of market capitalism. We're seeing that. And then the final point, which is a general point, I don't want to miss out on the questions from your audience and from yourself, Robert. So I'll just put it as greater deglobalization. And with that, I worry very deeply about the risks of liberal democracy, what happens to democracy. That was really the thesis of my book, Edge of Chaos, that we talked about earlier, came out a year ago. a year or so ago. But the point of the matter is that we are seeing, I think this is going to be catalytic for more deglobalization, a greater, more balkanized, fragmented world.
Yeah, and yes, and whether it's people talking about sustainability or whether it's the kind of Trump, the anti-China rhetoric you're seeing in the US and increasingly in the UK, it feels like that's definitely on the cards. I mean, that's a sort of fascinating menu of things to discuss. So if I can ask, if people want to start putting questions in the Q&A or raising their hands, I'll ask one more question while we do that, which is and it kind of does tie in with that point, which is about China. I mean, I know you're one of the you visit the country regularly. You're extremely informed. Well, you used to visit the country regularly. In a way that we
there in November. I was there in November.
Back when we visited countries.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is a narrative, isn't there? There is an argument. As you said, authoritarian states seem to have done better in this crisis. Not just that China sort of is now back at work. 6 people get it, they do 10 million tests. All that. And just that sense that the West is the model that others should follow seems to have drained away. That if you're looking for inspiration as to how you deliver growth to your country, it's now almost easier to look for people, depressingly easy for people to look to authoritarian regimes because that way you also get to stay in power at the same time.
Touché. I think the important point here, and I still have a number of conversations with large investors in China and people who are there now, is China cannot succeed on its own. So it is true that the country and its political class have spread its tentacles across the world in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of trade. Now China is a leading bond underwriter for many countries. And as you know, it is the #1 foreign lender to the US government. So it's clear that its footprint as a country and its importance as an economy has definitely, to my mind, grown exponentially, and today really is really at paramount. But I think it's really important to understand that they recognize that they cannot succeed if the rest of the world's economy is faltering. So yes, it is true that they've been very vocal as a political class, very vocal about moving towards a more domestic consumer-based economy. They've been in train, that has been in train, but they still are very heavily dependent on trade with the United States and elsewhere. So they do need the world to get back on track. And so it really, in that regard, it's in their interest to see an improvement or a remedy of the general global economic malaise that the rest of the world is facing. That being said, what they have shown is that there are some levers, and this is an area that I'm very interested in, that governments can pull in a very efficient and quick way when the world is attacked or is vulnerable to something like a global pandemic. And I think that is something we'll be debating for years to come, but already many people around the world, many public policymakers, many business people were already concerned about the Western ideological beliefs in market capitalism and liberal democracy, given that we've seen populism in the West. We've also seen the market, certainly the 2008 financial crisis is very much seen as coming from the West. And so there are some limitations with Western ideological thinking is what people would say in China. And this pandemic has just provided a third data point for why we might need to revisit how this idea, notion of freedom is applied both in economics and politics.
Well, the questions are starting to flood in. So we'll start with, James Sproul. Is the declining globalization inevitable? Ideas, might it metamorphosize? Ideas are still very global, but supply chains might well become more localized. I mean, is it going to fragment, or is there going to be some sort of regionalization, or become more services based, given that you don't have to actually go to places and move stuff around?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, because I think just to take a step back and think about what the Washington Consensus was about. I mean, the pillars of globalization are trade and commerce. It were also capital flows, so the movement of money around borders were investment capital, The third point was about the movement of people. So immigration, a very key pillar of this globalization, the idea that people would move around. And then, as you pointed out a moment ago, James, this idea of ideas, the transfer of ideas. I would argue that in each of those four categories that are really the pillars of globalization, we're already seeing a diminution or a reduction. We know that tariffs and trade have been under threat even again before the sort of it getting into fever pitch post-COVID, or during COVID, I should say. But could there be more? Yes, I think that whether it's the NAFTAs and the sort of more regionalization of trade, I think we will see much more of that. In terms of capital, we've seen a much more home bias. Again, some people might say, well, this is just really an artifact of the current environment, but I would argue, no, it's not. The emerging markets performance, they had their peak in 2007. And since then, we have not seen, it's sort of underperformed as a sector. In terms of immigration, I mean, I don't really need to say much. I mean, we've seen a lot of disorderly immigration into Europe and elsewhere. But the fundamental point is that we have 70 million, according to the International Rescue Committee, 70 million people who are displaced today. It's the highest number on record. But I think that is the notion that we'll see more immigration, I think, is foolhardy. And the businesses that I spend time in, I think we're much more focused on that. And then very lastly, it's really the point about ideas. And I've talked about this idea of a splinter net. We're already seeing that there's splits. A splinter net is really this idea that you'll end up with a China-led versus a US-led technology platforms that will be in competition. They are already in competition, and what that means for supply chains and all of these things mean for supply chains, I think it means much more tough.
Well, so that's a good opportunity to talk about another question. We're asking how developing economies like your home country of Zambia will cope with COVID, given the other challenges they face. I mean, I've written about this in the Times and the FT, but one of the weird things is even the people who warned about pandemics expected them to hit the developing world much harder. They expected us to be able to cope, and that the real aftershocks will be felt in Africa and other places. And so far, that doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, I would take the view it's too early. It's to say that. Yes, with the information we have, that's true for where we are right now. But as you know, it's not yet the cold season in the southern hemisphere. In fact, June is really a turning point. We're already seeing a spike in Brazil and other places in even across Africa. So and South America, but also in Africa. And so my sense is let's wait and see. I mean, we're already I'm hearing in different fora. Already concerns about a second wave in developed countries. And so I think we do need to see what happens in developing countries, but I would not breathe a sigh of relief. But in terms of the impact on the health side, just as a rule of thumb, the World Health Organization estimates that we really should be spending $34 to $40 per person per annum in order to have a healthcare system. And many countries across the developing world just do not have anything near this. And so the vulnerabilities are enormous. And that, to me, is an immediate moral imperative. I worry deeply about that. Of course, the second point is the economies. These economies are vulnerable. They've got no growth, and they're heavily indebted, as I mentioned a moment ago, particularly to China, and what that distressed situation actually means in terms of their ability to restructure debt, not just extending maturities and changing coupons, but really about what that means and how they pay back is a whole other area that needs to be explored.
Yes, I mean, I've seen people on Twitter talk about global debt jubilees and various other ideas. Edward Bonham-Carter asks a very simple question. You mentioned inflation. What level do you expect it to hit, and how will or should the authorities react?
If I were able to predict these numbers, I'd be in Tahiti. I wouldn't be sitting at my desk trying to figure out what happens next. But what I will say is that there's a wonderful chart, and Robert, maybe I'll share it with you, and you can send it around if people are interested, looking at where we've already continued to see inflation. By that, I mean, increasing in prices in different sectors. So healthcare, education, those are all areas that have become much more expensive, which is, in a sense, a slightly odd, because you'd think that with technology, and it may change, but this is, with technology, you would expect that you'd actually see a reduction in the costs around being able to reduce the cost pressure in these sectors. But it's an interesting chart, and it shows over time how we've seen a real increase in certain sectors, as I mentioned, healthcare and education being two of those sectors. Areas such as food, for example, telecommunications have gone down. And so just to answer the question, when do I expect to see inflation? I don't know. But when you see a total package of stimulus package of 135 billion coming out, 1.3 trillion coming out of the ECB, and the numbers that we're seeing here in the United States, I think that together, it seems to me that it would be surprising if we didn't see inflation kick in within the next year. And
do you see that as a sort of will that as something we should tolerate, partly to help erode the debt, or do you think we should still be as firm again on it as we have been?
Well, it really depends where you are. I mean, we're talking about countries, many countries that have negative interest rates. I mean, the notion of a price increase, I think, will take a long time for us to feel full effects in some places, and more importantly, the sort of bandwidth, the levers for governments to react, I think, would be much more will differ depending on where you are on the spectrum. I mean, we're talking about zero interest rates in the US. I think the 10 years trading at 0.7 today. But I fundamentally think it's too hard a blanket question to give one stock answer. I think it really depends. I'm hearing that there's a lot more evidence of inflation in certain sectors in Japan now. So that where they are and how close they are to a path of rate increases is very different from where we might be in a place like the US.
Edward says he'll see you in Tahiti. So
I saw that. I'll see you, Edward, in Tahiti. I'd love that.
An anonymous attendee says, talks about your book, Dead Aid, called for fairer trade rather than aid to alleviate poverty in developing countries. Do you think that the UK's departure from the EU provides greater opportunities for this?
Well, the book was written about 10 years ago, and really the real point, the clarion call of that book was that I was hoping that African countries, but really countries that are heavily dependent on aid around the world, would be prepared for this type of a shock. Would be able to withstand the pressure of any type of shock and not be so heavily dependent on other countries? So in principle, yes. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to say no. It's bad that for discussions or engagement for the UK to reset and to have those types of discussions. But as a practical matter, I mean, the UK has its own vulnerabilities. Many of them I've highlighted in generic terms, in terms of worries about debt, worries about, what is the reform and work from home? What does that mean for tax base? What does it mean for future planning? I know that the UK government is thinking about renegotiating post-Brexit with the US and other leading economies. I think the question is, what is it that African governments are thinking about in terms of what they can sell globally? And more importantly, I think this idea, something we've been talking about for decades, this idea of a fragmented, sort of bilateral agreements, I just don't think really works. I think in a world that's becoming much more deglobalized, you want to be part of a region, is my sense. For African countries. So that's where I would put it.
So so you probably wouldn't have voted for Brexit then?
Well, I did. I'm hand up. I was a Remainer. I wrote articles saying that I thought that it was important for countries to remain. But again, to compare Britain, which was top 5 world economies, with many African countries, it's kind of foolhardy, because I think the African country situation is very desperate in many places.
And I mean, are you long or short on Britain in a sort of in the medium term?
You know what? I think I'm net neutral. I'm not taking on any, and I'll tell you why I say that. There are many reasons to be long Britain. I think that we have, chief among them, we have clarity. Whether you like it or not, we have clarity on direction. I think getting rid of a lot of uncertainty is always a good thing. So I'm happy about that. But at the same time, we don't know many of the sort of detailed aspects around what are we going to do in terms of technology. How does Britain compete more, beyond COVID, beyond Brexit? How are they going to compete? And I think those are plans that are being made and put together now. And so I certainly would not rule out Britain. I have a home there, and for me, it's extremely important that we see success. I mean, both in terms of politics and economics. So I am fundamentally optimistic, but I am definitely sitting on cash right now across the board.
Question from another anonymous attendee. You can give us your names, guys. And girls. Do you think that governments will be able to resist the temptation to levy windfall taxes on the COVID winners, online retail, say, or telecoms? And I suppose then a broader question from me on that. At what point, how do you see the ideal balance between stimulus, retrenchment, borrowing? How do you make the numbers add up? And start to worry about that.
I think we're going to see higher taxes, and I think that it will be skewed to large businesses and to wealthy individuals. That is my sense. I don't have any deep knowledge of this. It's just in thinking about how companies and governments operate in terms of balancing their budgets. It just seems to me that, even notwithstanding the MMTers, this modern monetary theorists who think that we can continue to run deficits ad infinitum without worry, I just think that it's gone too far. And so I do expect that the need to fund not just welfare programs, but to plug in gaps in terms of jobs and opportunity, I do think we're going to see higher taxes.
Oh, well, that's depressing.
I don't see how else you get to some semblance of stability. And again, stability doesn't mean a balanced budget. I've actually visited recently a number of states where they have a balanced budget policy. In the United States, this state of Utah charges 5%. It doesn't matter if you're a business, an individual. Everybody gets charged 5%, but they absolutely have a strict balanced budget approach. That is not how, certainly the federal government in the US doesn't run it like that. The UK doesn't run it like that. But I do think that more and more, this idea of just running, large budgets, large deficits for longer, I just think it's going to be hard to pull off. I think they're going to try and tax more.
So a question from Francesco Polo, which I think I know your answer to, but it's sort of interestingly indicative of what you're talking about, the splintering. He said, do you think that COVID was an unconventional war or not? I mean, presumably you don't believe that it was deliberately released.
Well, so I guess if I understand the question, I think the way I would say it is that what this COVID has revealed is that we're ill prepared for what I would call the modern war, which is going to be much more about pandemics. It's going to be much more about ideology. It's going to be much more, to my mind, about technology, winners and losers in technology. And so when I was in China, one of the things that baffled me the most was, and I think I can say this without throwing him under the bus, but Eric Schmidt, who was with me on a tour of some innovative technology space in China, made the point. He literally grabbed my arm and said, Dambisa, you need to understand something. China is 2 to 3 years ahead in terms of face recognition and AI. And it was surprising to me, and especially coming from somebody like Eric, who is very much avant-garde, very knowledgeable, and very much part of public policy in this space. So I'm not sure if I'm giving a lot more information and not really answering the question, but the fundamental point to me is that this is a new level of warfare, whether it's in bio threats or cyber technology. I think we need to upgrade our tools. And clearly this is revealed in this COVID epidemic that we've been quite ill prepared.
So a couple of overlapping questions, which I'll take together. Your article in The Economist talked about a Marshall Plan for Africa. So what would that look like if implemented? And should we worry about sort of neocolonialism and foreign aid post-COVID? And someone else is asking what you think the role of multinationals is and public-private partnerships in assisting African countries. So essentially, yes. What's your plan for Africa?
So I was very clear. I've gotten a lot of comments back, people saying, oh, you've changed your mind. I have not changed my mind. My fundamental view 10 years ago remains today, which is that large programs of aid from developed countries or from multinational institutions that are particularly open-ended, so that they are designed to be around in perpetuity to the recipient country, I do not believe work. And my book really articulated a whole list of structural problems that both in economics and politics that emerge from those types of systems. You get inflation, you get Dutch disease, or the killing off of the export sector, you get corruption, you get dependency, and you get the corrosive effects on whether or not the politics can survive. You can't have democracy if the government doesn't really care about what the local population thinks and is really pandering to external donors. So I talked about that. That to me has not changed. What I'm arguing and what I've argued in the Economist article is for a Marshall Plan. And this is exactly the same argument I made in my book a decade ago, which is to say interventions of aid that are short, sharp, and finite, much like the Marshall Plan was, actually do show evidence of success. The Marshall Plan was from 1948 to 1952. It was very specifically designed to support reconstruction in Europe. It was about $135 billion in today's terms. It was about 13 billion at that time, but it was not open-ended. It was a very, very strong, sharp intervention. With respect to the article in The Economist that I wrote a couple of weeks ago, really I was arguing that there is a need for an African Marshall Plan, given some of the statistics that I touched on already, that this under ability for countries in Africa to pay for healthcare. So there's a moral imperative in terms of just pure healthcare. We need to support them in health, but there's also an economic imperative, both in terms of stabilizing those economies, but also potentially as a stimulus, because these economies are vulnerable to trade, not just from China, but from elsewhere. But most importantly, I argued in the piece that there is also an imperative for Western countries because they are losing the ideological war, shall we call it, in a world where China is now, both in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of trade, but also in terms of lending, is now run far ahead. Not just for Africa, but around the world. And really, if you want to stamp your imprimatur as being a leader in ideology, market capitalism, and liberal democracy, the West had to show an interest. And I will just conclude here, just Robert, to say that I understand, given the debts and deficits and the enormity of the challenges that Western countries are facing, that this could seem somewhat fanciful and it's almost absurd. How can we be talking about getting multiple, at least $1 trillion of aid to these countries when we're so vulnerable? But really, I thought that it was really important to articulate that there was this imperative, and we need to also make sure that that's very clearly on the agenda.
One thing which has always puzzled me is that in the 19th century, the UK essentially, the British Empire wasn't just about a physical presence. It effectively bankrolled the development of Argentina, America. The city of London provided the loans to build the infrastructure in sort of quite a similar way to that China is doing now. But we seem to have abandoned that model. We're not, London has these immense pools of capital, but we're not sort of taking them out to the fastest growing countries in the world and saying, not just Africa, but India as well. We're not saying to them, hey, we're gonna help you build your infrastructure, and we'll get a nice return from it over the next few decades.
Yeah, and I think it's the second part of the question was about was there a risk of colonialization? I think my view is that ultimately this is about leadership. And that if we have leaders, not just in the West, but really leaders in the emerging markets who are able to articulate what their plans are and come up with credible plans. So not fanciful plans that are funded by somebody else, in perpetuity, but real credible plans. You don't really run the risk of those vulnerabilities. If you look around the emerging markets now, a lot of countries are vulnerable because they have got this exposure. Dare I say it, my own home country of birth, Zambia, is in an extremely vulnerable position right now. They owe money to the Chinese. They owe money on the secondary markets, and Venezuela is another one which is in this state. I think those types of situations could, in principle, be avoided if there's a much better thinking as to how you deploy this capital and also where you get this money from. I mean, it's a longer conversation around how the Chinese have landed with the debt in the first place. But fundamentally, I think we need to think about how to deploy capital in a more sophisticated and smarter way.
So changing the subject, you're getting asked all sorts of things. So I'm trying to group them into interesting groups. So James Turner says you sit on the board of Chevron, and has this crisis changed any of the discussions about clean energy and decarbonisation? And Rod Richardson says, similarly, anti-competitive energy and power sectors globally are a barrier to development and clean energy growth. You know, do you see a significant upside to UK leadership on breaking these barriers down via free trade agreements, for example? I mean, sort of intertwined questions about, does this intensify the move towards greenery, or do people think, oh, we can't really afford it?
No, so, I think I think it's really important to understand that no energy company, and I'm not just talking about Chevron, I'm talking about our competitors as well. No energy company has done nothing around the transition to a different type of energy source. It would be crazy for them to do that. I mean, it would be completely antithetical to their own planning for innovation, but also, more importantly, it would be a death sentence. It's an existential crisis, I would argue, for many companies if they don't look out and say what is happening to the underlying product that we sell. Chevron in particular just celebrated 140 years. It did not always do fossil fuels. It has itself innovated, and I just think it's one of the most frustrating things for me as a board member is that there seems to be this perhaps unstated view that somehow these energy companies are not doing anything, not only in terms of mitigating the concerns around greenhouse gases and climate change problems, but that they're not doing anything innovative to think about the energy transition. And both of those are just patently wrong. And, from my own druthers, I was born in Africa. There are still 1.2 billion people on the planet who have no access to cheap or reliable energy. Go and see what's happening in South Africa. This is a more developed economy, but they have load shedding. I am interested in solutions. I'm not interested in problem identification just for the sake of it. And what I can tell you is, again, not just Chevron, but the whole industry is at the tip of the spear in finding solutions to this energy crisis, both in terms of the delivery of cost-effective, reliable energy, but also in terms of adopting and adapting to real concerns around climate change. And so whether it's biofuels, hydro, batteries, geothermal, I mean, we are invested in a whole slew of the energy stack. And, does this catalyze those discussions? Perhaps at the margin, but I mean, from my vantage point, we were already there. We were already talking about these issues. And so I from my perspective, I really think that this is a narrative that needs to be more clearly articulated. I happen to also serve on the Oxford University Endowment Investment Committee, and I know that the student body there and others are deeply frustrated. And again, I think it's partly to do with a lack of understanding of what exactly these companies are doing. The last point I'll just make on this is that even as much reading and knowledge as I feel like I've acquired in energy, I'm not an energy scientist. I don't know how to create energy. I mean, perhaps rubbing two sticks together could light a fire, but I don't know how it is, as a practical matter, energy is produced so that I don't have to worry, and you don't have to worry, Robert, about switching on your lights every day without concern about it being disrupted. And so we need that type of knowledge and that type of expertise from the people who are already doing this to figure out what the real opportunities are for change. And so this is where I stand on this issue.
Yes, so I was just looking at, just by chance, I was reading Matt Ridley's new book on how innovation works, and what the statistic he shows is, in 1880, a minute's work would buy you, on average, 4 minutes of light. Via a kerosene lamp. By 1950, it was up to 7 hours, and by 2000, it was 17 times higher. So whatever we're doing to generate energy, we're doing it pretty well.
Yeah, look, and there's a whole broader discussion. I mean, there are clearly second order costs and issues that we need to talk about in all these different areas. But I think the notion that we should just defund energy companies, I mean, frankly, is very limited in terms of thinking, as far as I'm concerned.
So two questions from people from Zambia, in fact, and it's one of the wonderful things about doing this, that we get people from all around the world, as opposed to just those who can make it into London. So what should Africa be doing to mitigate the effects of that pandemic, asks Sondwaya Duma. And Daniel Simwaba asks, which spikes are we like to see, inflationary spikes or debt or other problems? And what does it mean for the future of our currency and unemployment?
So, one of the things I've done over the last several years is I've run marathons, and marathons are 42 kilometers, which is 26.2 miles, extremely painful. But one of the reasons I'm bringing it up in answering the first question,
it's as if you weren't impressive enough already. You also run marathons.
It wasn't. My times are not impressive. I did finish all 4, but my times are not impressive. I'm actually registered to run the New York Marathon this year, but I don't know if it's going to go ahead. But the point I'm trying to make is that everyone is looking for a quick solution, myself included. But, and one of the things I learned from even the marathon, I would love to be able to press a button and be at this from the start line to the finish line very quickly. It doesn't work like that. And so a question like, what do you think African countries should do? I can't give you a quick answer. This is what they need to do, because the problem is it goes back to what I said earlier. It's so multifaceted, it's so complicated. Economic development is very difficult. And if you don't make the right decisions today, you're not going to end up in 10, 15, 50 years from now with right outcomes. My partner talks a lot about this idea of suboptimal decisions. If you make a bad decision today, every other decision that you make that follows is by definition a bad decision, because it's founded on a weak decision. So why am I telling you all this? This is to say that there are a lot of, to my mind, bad decisions that get made. And this is not just an Africa problem, it's not a Zambia problem, it's a global problem. I think we've seen even in the United States, one of the reasons globalization's got such a bad name is that we weren't investing in infrastructure. We were fighting wars instead. So there were some trade-offs there that were decisions that were made that it's better to spend trillions of dollars on a war in Afghanistan and Iraq than to invest in infrastructure in the United States, and the consequences for education and healthcare and ultimately income inequality are now clear. So as I think about the context, the question coming from Zambia, we have to be much more this need for temerity, so a certain level of confidence, but also at the same time, it's a lot of humility that we've gotten it wrong for such a long period of time, that it's time to actually really put together plans that work, that are viable, and that are sustainable over long periods of time. At a very high level, I would just point to the fact that I mentioned a moment ago, that I'm involved with businesses that have been around for 100 years. I was on the board of Barclays Bank. Barclays Bank has been around for over 300 years, over 300 years. That means it's a company that has managed to survive through world wars, through industrial revolution, through pandemics. I think that, and in many respects, in a viable way. I think that governments need to focus on being data-driven. They need to focus on being forward-leaning. They need to really be really very focused on measured outcomes. We need to measure our outcomes. We can't just think that things are going to happen. Measure those outcomes, and then finally move away from issues of corruption. These are sort of 4 tenets that Mike Bloomberg has talked about a lot. I mean, these are simple 4 points that we seem to fail to execute on as government. So that's what I would say at the general point. This more specific question, what's going to happen to the currency, inflation? It's not a surprise that many countries, again, it's not just Zambia, are in an incredibly vulnerable place. The emerging markets, I just had a debate with Ruchir Sharma, who for many years has been a big proponent of emerging markets. Even I said to him, what sector should I invest in the emerging markets? We've had, since 2007, we've had very poor performance in the emerging markets. Investors don't want to keep investing on a promise that doesn't actually ultimately come good. And so if it's not money good, don't expect investment. So do I think there are vulnerabilities in terms of growth, in terms of debt, in terms of foreign exchange, in terms of inflation? Yes, I do think that there are. But I wouldn't say it's just an Africa story or a Zambia story. I think the world in its entirety, I can go through the list, but there are some countries that are doing much better in terms of their fiscus than others. And those countries will do much better in this crisis.
So I've been saving this question for a while. you mentioned briefly amid the deluge of gloomy news, you mentioned hope. I mean, what trends do you see at present that make you hopeful for the next few years rather than fearful?
I love technology. I think technology is going to be revolutionary. There's a whole other debate to be had there. I mean, I mentioned the splinter net, but there is a debate about how, and I think Peter Thiel in particular has talked a lot about this, the idea that 50 years ago, or certainly post the Wright, just after the Wright brothers, but certainly 50 years ago, 1960s, it would have taken us 6 hours to fly from New York to London. And we've had this enormous amount of technological advancement, but it still takes 6 hours to fly from New York to London. So the question is, where is that technological improvement, those innovations, where are they being had? And I think that might be a question for another debate. But in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, the delivery of public goods at scale, I really am optimistic about what technology can do. We're seeing it now. And I've been very impressed, if I can use the word, at how quickly the world has been able to flex and move to work from home. I mean, that is something pretty remarkable to even be a part of. And so there are many other opportunities, I believe, in the technology space that we may not even be thinking about, that will, I think, will hopefully continue to help drive human progress.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the sort of arguments I've used is to ask people to imagine that we are having this pandemic if you didn't have Netflix, if you didn't have Amazon, if you didn't have Zoom, if you still had a sort of your old Nokia 6310. I think it is a sort of
well, which is perhaps why we saw the horrific numbers. I mean, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people died at the Spanish flu in 1918. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that people still had to go to work. They were still outside. Maybe information was harder to distribute. And these things can end up in a catastrophe.
So one final question, because I'm afraid we've only got 2 minutes left. You mentioned that you were sitting on cash at the moment. If you had to invest in something, what would it be?
It would be technology. But technology is such a broad term. I mean, I'm very interested in different aspects of the stack, software versus hardware. Partly because I'm interested, I am very focused on things that disrupt longer term public goods. So I'm not really particularly excited about social networks and that kind of thing. I mean, yes, you could make the argument that they can generate high returns, but because of my interests in terms of public policy, I'm much more focused on areas that can be disrupted in terms of public goods.
Well, Dr. Moyo, I mean, there are still many questions on the thing. I mean, I think sadly we're not going to have time to get to them because I know you have to go, and so do many others. Thank you so much for your time. It's always fascinating hearing from you, and I'm sure everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have. This is actually the first webinar I've done. You'll be pleased to know where the number of, I don't know if everyone else can see this, but the number of participants has actually been ticking up rather than down throughout the throughout the conversation as word spreads that there's something interesting going on.
Oh, well, thank you so
much for that. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please do follow us at CPS Think Tank on Twitter and visit us at cps.org.uk and sign up to our to our newsletter list so we can let you know about more events like this. But
please follow me too on @Dambisa Moyo on all platforms.
Indeed, and buy her books. Why not?
While you're at it, thank you.
Thank you all very, very much.
Bye.